All right, welcome to the third screencast for Chapter 6. In this screencast, we're going to be putting the supply and demand curves back together on the same graph, in the same model, and we're going to take a look at consumer and producer surplus using that model. All right. So what does consumer surplus look like graphically? Well, first, the height of the demand curve is our maximum willingness to pay for that unit of the good. So we did it with 3 people before when we introduced consumer surplus. Now we're going to do it for a whole bunch of people, like we normally do with our supply and demand diagrams. We usually assume lots and lots of buyers, lots and lots of sellers. So here we're going to have lots and lots of buyers, and so that height of the demand curve is going to be someone's maximum willingness to pay for that unit of the good. So the first unit, someone has a really high willingness to pay. The second unit, a little lower. Third unit, fourth unit, fifth unit. So there are people with willingness to pay for the number of things on that demand curve. All right. So consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve and above the price for all units purchased. All right. You only get consumer surplus on units that actually are purchased. All right. Consumer surplus is not the entire area under the demand curve. All right. You stop when you get to the equilibrium price. And I'm talking you through this first, and then we're going to do it graphically in a minute. What is producer surplus graphically? Well, the height of the supply curve is the firm's lowest price it's willing to accept to sell that unit. So it's the willingness to sell for everyone. Again, when we introduced producer surplus, I only had 3 people, and so we kind of had this stair-step supply curve. But now we're going to assume lots and lots of sellers in this market, and so we're going to get a nice smooth supply curve, and that supply curve represents the willingness to sell for each unit of the good. So the willingness to sell for that first unit is very low. The next one's a little higher, higher, higher. For the last unit that you're graphing, the willingness to sell is very, very high, and it almost never gets sold because that willingness to sell is so high. All right. So the firm only gets producer surplus on units that it actually sells. Producer surplus is not the entire area above the supply curve. Remember, lots of those goods, even though firms would be willing to sell them at those very high prices, the market price is probably going to be below, at least for some people, what their willingness to sell is. All right. And some of you experienced this in our experiments. You had a really high cost, we called it, but it could be willingness to sell in this version of the model, and you just never could sell your orange in the experiment. There's a similar thing going on here with the supply curve. All right. So market efficiency happens when total surplus or social welfare is maximized. All right. So total surplus is going to just be consumer surplus plus producer surplus. That is total surplus. And this is not a minus sign here. This is just a bullet point that's unfortunately a dash. Total surplus equals consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So in free markets with voluntary trade, the kind that we've been illustrating with our perfect competition supply and demand model, consumers buy until their willingness to pay is equal to the market price. Suppliers will sell until their willingness to sell is equal to the market price. And this gives us efficiency. And it's a certain kind of efficiency. It's an efficiency called Pareto efficiency. And Pareto efficiency happens when you can't make someone better off without making someone worse off. All right. So if all the conditions of our perfect competition model are met, we know that the market price will give us Pareto efficient outcome. All right. So this occurs when total surplus is maximized in the market. All right. There's no surplus laying around on the table to be gained. All trades that would make at least one producer and at least one consumer happy have been made. So there's no surplus laying around that could be had. All right. So let's take a look at consumer surplus and producer surplus for a gallon of milk. All right. So here's our demand curve. Here's our supply curve. And here are our prices. All right. So let's say we have an equilibrium price for milk that's $4, and the equilibrium quantity is 6 million gallons of milk. All right. So this is the entire milk market. 6 million gallons of milk for an equilibrium price of $4. All right. So where is the consumer surplus? Where is the producer surplus? All right. So think about, where are there consumers who have a willingness to pay that is higher than the price? All right. And it's this area. right? All of the consumers that are on this part of the demand curve have a willingness to pay higher than the price. So we say all these transactions will happen. They're all paying less than they would be willing to pay. And so they're getting surplus. So this person gets surplus, this person gets surplus, person A here gets this amount of surplus. There's people all along here that are buying the good at $4 and they're getting surplus. So just think of little individual skinny lines. And then all of this is shaded because all these individuals get consumer surplus. This person here at B would be willing to pay $5, but they only have to pay $4, so they get consumer surplus. All these people, all the way down, all these units are sold until we get to where the willingness to pay equals the equilibrium price. All right. What about for producer surplus? It's the same thing on the other side. This is the willingness to sell of the producers. All right. This producer here at C has a willingness to sell at $2.50. So at $4, he's like, excellent, I get $1.50 per gallon that I sell in terms of producer surplus. This person here has a very low willingness to sell, and they get a huge producer surplus. And all of these producers live up and down this supply curve, and they have a willingness to sell that is below the price, so they will indeed sell the milk all the way up to this person who is just equal to the price. Their willingness to sell is just equal to the price, and that's it. All of these suppliers have a willingness to sell, but it's above the equilibrium price. All of these producers have a willingness to buy, but it's below the equilibrium price. So they can't find a way to buy it. They would if the price fell, some of these people would start buying. Similarly, if the price went up, some of these producers would start selling. All right. But for now, at this equilibrium price, this is the consumer surplus, this is the producer surplus. The entire triangle here, this big triangle, is the total surplus for the gallon of milk in this market. All right. So in free markets, competitive markets, both parties are self-interested, benefit from trade. All right. All the trades that are mutually beneficial will happen. The benefits might not be equal, however. All right. So there in this particular graph we just drew, it looked like more or less the producers and consumers made off with about the same kind of surplus. But as we're going to see, that doesn't have to be the case. The producers could do way better than the consumers and vice versa. All right. So efficiency, we said that was an efficient outcome, meaning there was no surplus left to be allocated. There was no exchange that could happen that would give producer surplus or consumer surplus. That's efficiency. Pareto efficiency, that no one can be made better off without making someone worse off. All right. The gains from trade are maximized. All right. Economic welfare is maximized. That's what efficiency cares about. But notice it doesn't necessarily care about how that economic welfare is maximized. All right. That's about equity. All right. So efficiency asks, is the pie as big as it can be? Right. But it doesn't really ask, efficiency doesn't really ask the question or address the question of, did people split up that surplus in a fair way? All right, so it's an important distinction to keep in mind. The example I like to use for Pareto efficiency is that me having everything and all of you out there watching the screencast having nothing is an efficient outcome. All right, if you can't make any of you better off without taking something from me, that makes me worse off. That would violate the rule. Okay. So that's a very efficient outcome, but it's probably not a very equitable outcome. So efficiency and equity are not the same thing, all right? So I want to leave you with this clip from a movie called Just Go With It, and it's Adam Sandler and a little girl, and he's trying to convince her to pretend to be his daughter. For some reason, I've never seen the movie, but you're going to see them negotiate, and then you're going to see them reveal their willingness to pay and willingness to sell, and we'll see what their consumer and producer surplus are. All right.